My name is Simon and I've been a professional... Hey, my name is Simon and I've been a professional photographer for the last 10 years or so. I've been shooting everything from weddings, portraits, events to, slowly transitioning into hospitality and architectural photography. And the thing is, I have to admit that I'm a little bit crazy. Not only have I shot with literally every brand that is out there and tried, every camera, sensor and lens combination that is out there, I'm always, looking at the other side and thinking that the grass is, somehow greener on the other side. And so recently I've got the itch to, I have to upgrade my camera because I've been using a Fujifilm X-T3 for the longest time. And then I've not only looked into Fujifilm, but I looked across different brands and sensor sizes. So I've been, thinking about upgrading to full frame again, or to Fujifilm's medium format, or even going down to micro four thirds. And I came up with a huge Excel sheet with all the different lens camera combinations, because nowadays with mirrorless cameras you can adapt so many lenses, so you have too much choice, honestly. And heck, I even asked ChatGPT. I uploaded my Excel sheet and I asked to calculate the 3-4 best options following a few ground rules I set up. And basically ChatGPT came back and produced some sort of overflow error because it just couldn't calculate that much data, right? So trust me when I say it was a lot, and I looked at really too many options, to be honest. And in the end, I stayed with APS-C because for my type of work, that works just fine, right? But during this process, I had the idea that it would be interesting to have an unbiased look across all different sensor sizes, brands, and figure out, like looking at a few different personas, so to speak, who do different types of photography, and then look what sensor size, what system would suit them best for their needs. First and foremost, in terms of bang for your buck, in terms of value. So, for example, we'll look at, event photography with a 24 to 70, 2.8, and the 70 to 200, 2.8. What would be the best and cheapest option to get into some sort of kit like this, right? Because honestly, I think there's a lot of miscommunication out there regarding sensor sizes. People say stuff like, full frame, the cameras are not too bad. That's not the expensive part, but the lenses are so much more expensive than, for example, APS-C. Or people say stuff like medium format produces some sort of magic look because the depth of field is so thin. Or people say you cannot produce professional results, so you can't work professionally with micro four thirds or APS-C, you need full frame. And most of these statements just are not true. So in order to be at the same page with our little comparison here, we have to understand one key concept, and that is how one lens behaves differently on different sensor sizes. So if you base everything on full frame, and everything is kind of based on full frame anyway, because 35mm film is what we had for decades. Then if you have a let's say 50mm lens with an f1.8 aperture, and you put that lens on a full frame body, it is exactly that. It's a 50mm f1.8 lens. But if you put that on an APS-C size camera, then it becomes a 75mm lens, because there's a crop factor of 1.5 going from full frame to APS-C. And regarding the aperture, that f1.8 behaves more like a f2.8 in terms of depth of field. So you get you get more depth of field, you get less shallow depth of field, right? But keep in mind, the light gathering capabilities are the same of the f1.8. That does not change. However, and I'm speaking very, I'm generalizing here. As high ISO performance generally gets better when sensor sizes get bigger. So bigger sensors have better high ISO capabilities in general. If you look at cameras of the same age, right, of the same era, then that somehow equals out, right? Because if you can get away with ISO 6400 looking the same as ISO 3200, then 75mm f2.8 lens on full frame and a 50mm f1.8 lens on APS-C will look identical, both in terms of depth of field as well as in terms of image quality regarding high ISO. So that is APS-C to full frame, right? You just multiply the focal length by 1.5 as well as the aperture by 1.5, and then you have the equivalent, right? And you have the equivalent in full frame. Going from micro four thirds to full frame, or the other way around, going from the full frame lens to micro four thirds, that crop factor is 2, and going from full frame to medium format, and I'm talking about this small medium format that's used by Fujifilm GFX, then the crop factor is 0.79, right? It's the other way around because medium format is obviously a bigger sensor than full frame. And that concept of having equivalent lenses across different sensor sizes is the base of our little comparison today. Keep in mind though, for the sake of simplicity and just in order to being able to create a video like this, I'll not look into any differences in optical capabilities, right? Because of course, 50mm lens for Sony full frame and the equivalent lens for medium format might produce the exact same depth of field and focal length, and but they might have vastly different optical capabilities in terms of one has better bokeh than the other, one has less chromatic aberration, and one is sharper and whatnot, But this comparison should just give you an overview of what different sensor sizes and different systems within the sensor sizes can achieve, what are the limitations, and what are the price differences for achieving similar looks, right? And just before we begin, a few ground rules here. I'll, in terms of cameras, I look at the minimum, right? I look at what is the minimum amount of camera, so to speak, you need to get this certain job done, right? So I'll not always pick flagship cameras, and I'll not always pick the newest stuff. At some point, I'll even look into used cameras, right? Because, for example, for architectural stuff, you don't need great autofocus capabilities. And one more thing, just to keep this video somewhat reasonable in terms of length, I'll not look into adapting lenses, right? So I'll only choose native options where you don't need an adapter, for the most part at least. And all the prices are in euro as of March 2024. And while I tried to look at the cheapest pricing options, I, didn't look an hour. What's the cheapest price online for a certain lens, right? You have to do your own research here. All right, let's get into it. The first persona we're talking about is somebody who shoots events, right? And that can be events of any kind. That could be wedding receptions, there can be nightclub shootings, corporate events, all sort of stuff. And what you need for that kind of photography is, first and foremost, you need good autofocus capabilities, right? And then in terms of lenses, you want something that covers anything from wide angle to telephoto. So most people, and I think that's the best choice, having photographed a few events, is going with something like 24-70 as well as 70-200, because you don't want to change lenses all the time, right? You probably have, if you're doing that professionally, you have two bodies, one with a 24-70 and one with a 70-200, which covers pretty much everything you need. And pretty much every major manufacturer makes these lenses, right? And they usually come in f4 and f2.8 gutting aperture, right? So first we'll look into 24-70 and 70-200 f4 for comparison. Right off the gate, we can get rid of Fujifilm medium format just because their autofocus is just lacking and not good enough for this kind of scenario. Sadly, we have also said goodbye to Canon APS-C and Nikon APS-C just because those two manufacturers are very, very limited, sadly, in terms of their lens choice for APS-C cameras, right? They have great amount of glass for full frame, but in terms of APS-C, they are severely limited, so they are not an option either. So that leaves us with all the full frame options with Fujifilm APS-C, Sony APS-C, and to some degree Micro Four Thirds with the Panasonic G9 Mark II. For Canon, I went with the Canon R8, not a flagship, but autofocus is decent, and I think it has 24 megapixels, which it's absolutely enough. Resolution generally doesn't matter with event photography. Well, we have the RF 24-70 f4 as well as the 70-200 f4, decent choice. With Nikon, I went with the Z5. Probably this is a little bit on the fence regarding autofocus. I've been reading, I've never used the Z5 to be fair, but I've been reading a lot on Reddit, and some say it is up to par and some don't agree. But as you see, it is pricing wise a little bit cheaper than the rest, so you can make an argument that you can just, you know, spend the extra 500 to 800 bucks and get a Z6 Mark II or wait for the Z6 Mark III or whatever, and then would be good. With Sony, I went with an A7 III as well as a 24-105 and the 70-200 G Master Mark I. I think Sony is still, even with the A7 III, which is an older camera, autofocus is just excellent. Only surpassed on this list maybe by the Panasonic S5 Mark II, because this is the newest camera on the list, as well as the Sony A6700. Those would be my top picks on this list in terms of pure autofocus capabilities. And if you have a closer look at this list, you see pretty much anything works, maybe except Micro Four Thirds. I'll come to that in a second. But it's personal choice if you're using APS-C with a Sony or Fujifilm, or you're going full frame. They will all produce the same results, more or less. So you're looking at autofocus and personal taste, really. With the Panasonic, it's a little bit different. With the 10-25 1.7 and 25-50 1.7, you're getting essentially a little bit more than the f4 and the other ones. You're getting 3.4 if you multiply it with the crop factor of 2. But you are limited in terms of focal length. You have an equivalent to full frame 20-50 3.4 as well as a 50-100 3.4, which is great on the wide end, but not ideal on the telephoto. And that's why I added the Olympus 75 1.8, which, you know, equals to a 150 3.6. But then you have 3 lenses, which is not ideal, and it's also a whole lot more expensive than the other options. So to wrap things up in this category, I'd probably go with Sony full frame. Then we look at event photography. same persona, but now we're looking at f2.8. And immediately we see APS-C is no longer an option just because there are no equivalent lenses in APS-C world. So you just have full frame. And you see when you're going with Sony or Nikon or Panasonic, the price gap between the f4 and the f2.8 combos is not that steep. So probably my recommendation would be, if you're a serious event photographer, just going into one of these manufacturers and going with f2.8, because you get one stop better light gathering capabilities, as well as less depth of field, which will produce nicer images in general. And I've also still added the Panasonic variant here, just because it is with the 3.4 equivalent. It's somewhat between f4 and f2.8, exactly in the middle to be exact. I mean, it's still more expensive than the other full frame options, except Canon. So I wouldn't do it. I think the sweet spot is somewhere Panasonic, Sony, because there's a better, the cameras here have better autofocus capabilities than the Nikon Z5. Canon is always a little bit more expensive because recently they closed up their mount, so no third parties can produce lenses for Canon, which is a shame. And that's a thing that we'll see throughout this video, that Canon tends to be a little bit more expensive, right? Okay, for our next persona, we're looking into somebody who shoots portraits, right? And to keep things simple, I went with one focal length, and that is 85 millimeters, because I think 85 millimeters is probably the most used portrait lens, right? And for first comparison, we go with an 85 f1.8 lens, okay? Just because this is something that every sensor size more or less can reproduce, the equivalent of an 85 1.8. And 85 1.8 is, in my opinion, probably everything you'll ever need in terms of ability to separate your subject from the background, to create bokeh, and that. I think it's totally enough to create stunning images, professional results. So let's get into it. You see, immediately when you look at it, you see that it is, you should avoid the biggest sensor as well as the smallest sensor. Micro Four Thirds and medium format are vastly more expensive on this list than APS-C and full frame. Granted, the Fujifilm GF1110 f2 comes out to more of a f1.6 lens than a 1.8 lens, but it's still close enough, and I'd say that you wouldn't really see the difference. And the Panasonic 42.5 1.2 even comes out to an 85 2.5, where you see the difference. It's half a stop, and it's still more expensive than all the full frame and APS-C options. And in my opinion, you can't really go wrong with all those options in the middle here. I picked cameras here that are again with Sony APS-C and Fujifilm and Panasonic. I picked even cheaper cameras, just because autofocus capabilities are not that important with portraits. They are important, and I think all the cameras I mentioned here are up to par. But you don't have, generally you don't have moving subjects or fast moving action or anything like that. So, probably eye autofocus single point will work just fine, and that's why you can get away with cheaper cameras. So I'd say between, you know, APS-C and full frame, it's all fair game really. It doesn't really matter, and they'll produce great results, right? All right, but that's only f1.8, right? And the advantage of bigger sensors, especially full frame, is that they have lenses like an 85mm 1.2 or 105 1.4 that will produce much shallower depth of field, and you know, for all those bokeh loving people out there, right? So in this next comparison, I looked at every lenses that one uses for portrait, like 50 to 135 is a range that's generally used by portrait photographers. And here I looked at the most amount of blur, the blurriest background any camera system with any lens can achieve, right? And this number that calculates the blur in the image is, I have it in percent here. It's quite complicated, but you can look it up at sites like depth of field simulator. What it basically means is the higher the percentage, the more blurry your background is. Like, let's keep it at that. It's obviously a little bit more, it's much more complex, but that's what it basically is. But in general, it's the only metric we can use to compare different lenses with different apertures, different focal lengths, at different camera sensors, and establish which combination will produce the blurriest background, so to speak. And if you look at that, and this metric should show how blurry of a background you can get at what price level, right? And a few things that strike me here is, people say medium format produces the creamiest bokeh and like most separation, but if you look at it, we have roughly 5.5K you'd spend for the Fuji GFX combination only to get roughly the same amount of blur in your background as with a Fuji XS10 in this case, paired with a Viltrox 75mm f1.2. And that's like 4,000 euros difference for the same amount of blur, right? And it kind of does away with this whole sentiment of you need the biggest sensors give you the most separation, right? Then you look at the full frame options and you see that the Sigma 105 f1.4 is probably the lens with the most blur you can get, right? But the 85s 1.2 from Canon and Nikon are also incredible in terms of blurry background and portrait photography, as well as the 135 1.8s that are produced by Nikon, Canon and Sony. They are also incredible and also incredibly expensive, of course. If we look at it again, what is true though is that Micro Four Thirds just is not the best system for you to get the shallowest depth of field, because the best option again is this 42.5 f1.2 lens from Panasonic, which is still an 85 f2.4 in full frame terms. So that's probably, if you're a portrait photographer, don't go Micro Four Thirds. I'd say full frame or APS-C is probably the best choice. If you have the money, medium format is also a good choice, obviously, but you're spending a lot more money for, basically the same results, right? All right, the next persona is the Milky Way chaser, and that's one of my favorites. Milky Way chaser / adventure photographer. Um, what does that mean? Well, that's somebody who loves hiking, mountaineering, and brings the camera to photograph the Milky Way above a glacier somewhere. Or Milky Way could also be northern lights. Adventure, mountain stuff in general. And I've done my fair share of this, so I know exactly what I'm talking about. And what you need for that, or what would be a good idea for that, is having one lens that's extremely, that's lightweight. It's a wide-angle lens, ultra wide, something around 20 millimeters is perfect in my opinion. Has a big maximum aperture to gather all the light available for Milky Way and the Northern Light stuff, whilst keeping the ISO as low as possible. As well as, and this lens can also be used for daytime stuff in the mountains for all your wide angle shots. As well as probably a lightweight telephoto lens is also a good option, because when you're in the mountains you tend to stick with the extremes in terms of focal length, because you either want to capture like dramatic wide angle views where you capture everything, or you want to go really tight and have a lot of compression with a telephoto and in a way produce portraits of mountains, right? And having stunning silhouettes and that's kind of stuff. Maximum aperture doesn't really matter for the telephoto lens, because you're generally at f8, f11 anyway. But what does matter here is weight. So this comparison has also a weight metric. For the camera, I would say autofocus doesn't really matter, but resolution does matter, because probably you want to print those images you took. So I set the rules up here for having at least 40 megapixels. That right away gets rid of Canon APS-C, Nikon APS-C, Sony APS-C, as well as Panasonic Olympus OM system Micro Four Thirds, because they just don't have cameras with this amount of resolution. The only non-full frame or medium format option here is Fujifilm with their recent X-T5 and XH2 that have a 40 megapixel sensor. And if you look at the chart here, you immediately see that medium format probably is not the best option to go with, just because it's way more expensive, and it's also the heaviest. Even though I chose the GFX 50R, which is this rangefinder style camera, that's the lightest of the medium format cameras from Fujifilm. And then Canon just does not produce a prime lens, an ultra wide prime lens that is lightweight, so you have to go with the RF 15 to 35, which is an excellent lens, but it's heavy and it's expensive, right? And Canon also doesn't have a 40 megapixel plus camera that is cheap, or that's a little bit older, so you have to go with the R5 here, which is an expensive camera. So that's the reason why Canon is also extremely expensive. But other than that, Nikon, Sony, Panasonic, Fujifilm, they are all quite evenly matched, so it's up to taste, I would say. Personally, I'd probably go with either Sony or Fujifilm. But that's probably because those two systems I used for that kind of photography, and but in general you can't go wrong with either. Okay, our next persona is the travel photographer. So it's somebody who travels a lot, and you need to be lightweight again, and probably if you're I don't know, somewhere in Nigeria, walking the streets of Lagos, you want to have, you want to have one lens and one camera, and not, swapping lenses every second and having, huge amounts of gear with you. So you want one lens that can do everything, and while being quite compact. So that would be 24 to 105 equivalent, right? They are mostly f4, and the beauty of it is you really can do anything with it, right? It's not excellent in any particular field, but it's a good generalist. And right away, Fujifilm medium format does not produce a lens like that. And Canon APS-C, Nikon APS-C, as well as Micro Four Thirds, neither. And here we have this problem again, that the APS-C lens offerings of Nikon and Canon are severely limited. So across all different personas, if you go Nikon or Canon, I'd go full frame right away. I'd skip APS-C. If you want to go APS-C, I think Fujifilm or Sony are the only proper choices you can make, in my opinion at least. But if you look at it, Canon again is the most expensive route to go here. But other than that, they are somewhat evenly matched, I would say. Keep in mind though, with the APS-C options here with Fujifilm and Sony, we are using the Tamron 17 to 70, and 17 is not really 24mm equivalent. It's a little bit more, so you're losing a little bit on the wider end. But other than that, I think you cannot go wrong with either one. If I had to make a choice though, I'd probably go with APS-C here. Either Fujifilm or Sony, just what you prefer, just because they are even more compact and they are the cheapest. And I think if you're a travel photographer, they're probably close to $1,000 you can save going down to APS-C. Much better invested in going to a exotic location and doing one trip more. I don't know, but it's generally better invested in your travel expenses, in my opinion, right? So last but not least, let's look at architectural photography, hospitality photography, interior photography, and that's obviously my biggest area of expertise, so to speak. And what you want in interior architectural photography is tilt shift lenses, where when you have a normal wide angle, ultra wide angle lens, and in architecture you want to keep your vertical straight, right? And in order to do that, you have sometimes to go really, really low down, which produces a somewhat unnatural field of view. So with a tilt shift lens, you can shoot from eye level, for example, and then you shift the lens down, and you keep the vertical straight in that way. You could also do that in post using keystoning, but that works. You sacrifice a little bit of resolution, but if you want to be very precise with your framing and your composition, it's extremely helpful to see what you'll get right on location. So that's why tilt shift lenses are a must, in my opinion, as well as for my workflow at least, and I know for a fact for many other hospitality photographers, architectural photographers, they use a device called Cam Ranger, where in essence you set up your own Wi-Fi network, and then you can shoot from your iPad. You can be completely hands off your camera and do everything on your iPad, which is extremely beneficial when you're, I'm often walking around using a flash and having a flash in one hand, bounce it off the ceiling, and in my other hand I'd have the iPad and I'd shoot the camera. So that limits the systems available a little bit, because Panasonic full frame, for example, does not support Cam Ranger. And then I'd also look into, again, a higher resolution camera, just because you have the flexibility to crop in post, which is something you do a fair amount, in my opinion. So Canon, Nikon APS-C, Sony APS-C, and Micro Four Thirds, again, they don't have cameras with that amount of resolution, so we have to say goodbye to them. That leaves us with Fujifilm APS-C, Fujifilm medium format, Canon, Nikon, and Sony full frame. And I paired every combination with a 25mm equivalent tilt shift lens, as well as something around 18mm equivalent tilt shift. And that are the most used lenses, in my opinion. If you're doing hotel stuff, you probably use the 18 a little bit more. If you're doing architectural or interior work for an architect, you'd probably use the 24 more. And here you see, for example, where different sensor sizes have their benefits. For example, the Fujifilm GFX50R, the medium format camera, if you pair that with the excellent Canon 24 tilt shift lens, that becomes, due to the crop factor, it becomes something like an 18mm, right? So you have your first lens covered. And if you pair this lens with the Canon 1.4 extender, then you have 24 again. So you have essentially one lens with the adapter going Canon EF to Fuji GFX, as well as the extender, and you're pretty much covered, right? So that makes the Fujifilm system very competitive here. As well as the Fujifilm medium format sensor produces a 4:3 aspect ratio image, which naturally is quite beneficial for interior work, because you get more height, and so the amount of shift you need to do is becomes less. So you probably could also get away without tilt shift lenses on the medium format body, and that would make it even cheaper. Then you Canon, you have the R5 with the aforementioned Canon 24 tilt shift lens, as well as the really excellent Laowa 12mm 0D lens. 0D means zero distortion, with their magic shift converter. Magic shift converter from Laowa essentially transforms a 12mm lens into an 18mm shift lens on full frame. And I use this combination in this comparison with Nikon and Sony as well. And with Fujifilm, which is of course the APS-C sensor, I again use the excellent, and that's what I'm using personally, I again use the excellent 25mm tilt shift lens from Canon paired with a speed booster, so that I keep the 24mm field of view. And then I use the Laowa 12mm lens with a standard cheap shift adapter, because 12mm and the 1.5 crop factor equals out to an 18mm lens anyway. And then you have something like a cheap Photo DX shift adapter, and that works perfectly fine. And you see here, save Canon, all are extremely similar in price and all produce exactly the same quality, in my opinion, because in this area you are at f8 or f11 anyway on a tripod, ISO 100, so any differences in dynamic range between different camera sensors doesn't matter at all, because you are bracketing anyway, and it's you're using ideal you're in an ideal environment for your camera sensor, so to speak. You don't push anything to the limit, and that's the reason why I'm still using Fujifilm APS-C for my professional work just because I'm used to it and it works just fine. Finally, let's have a brief look into wildlife and sports photography. What you want here is obviously great autofocus, great burst rates in your camera, and in all honesty, I've never done sport or wildlife photography, so but from doing a little bit of research, I figured that a 300mm f2.8 equivalent lens is something of a workhorse in professional sports photography as well as wildlife. So we'll look at this focal length, and straight away, obviously Fujifilm medium format, autofocus, as well as they just don't produce lenses like that. It's completely different niche. Micro Four Thirds is the same, they just don't have lenses like that. As well as Canon and Nikon APS-C. You could go with the 70-200 f2.8 on these cameras, and that would get you to 300mm on the long end, but then you'd have an equivalent of f4, and we want f2.8 here. So, and Panasonic as well. Panasonic just, while their L mount is quite versatile, as they have all the Sigma glass, they currently don't have anything close to 300mm f2.8, which leaves us with Nikon, Canon full frame, Sony full frame, as well as Fujifilm APS-C, because Sony APS-C also doesn't have anything. So the outlier is Fujifilm APS-C, because they have a lens which is the 200mm f2, and if you multiply it with the crop factor, it comes out to a 300mm 2.8 on an APS-C body. If you pair that with the Fujifilm X-H2S, which has this excellent stacked sensor reading out super fast, you have great capabilities for burst rate, as well as autofocus is decent. And it's also the cheapest option here, right? Because when you look at Canon and Nikon, for example, even in this comparison, we use older EF mount and F mount respectively glass, because for the current Z and RF mounts, they don't have a 300mm 2.8. Well, Canon has the 100 to 300 2.8, which is extremely versatile, of course, but it's also extremely expensive, costing well above 10K. So if you're going this route and going with a 300mm 2.8, probably Fujifilm is a good option, even though it's APS-C. But again, that's not really my field of expertise here. The downside of this Fuji combination here is that while it's on paper the cheapest and the lens is absolutely excellent and absolutely on par with the other offerings, the autofocus is probably still somewhat behind Sony, Canon, maybe even Nikon when we look at the Z9 or Z8 here. So take that into consideration. But in my opinion, if you are a professional sports or wildlife photographer, spending that kind of money, you probably have a fair bit of more knowledge than I have in this field, and you know exactly what you need and what you don't. Well, that was a long video, even though I tried to keep it somewhat simple and limited, and but it's just, there's so many options. I think the takeaway should be that if you're starting out and if you need a versatile camera system, full frame probably is the best bet nonetheless. APS-C would be the close second. I'd avoid the extremes with medium format and APS-C and Micro Four Thirds, as there just isn't enough versatility. And as I said before, if you're going APS-C, I think there's only Sony and Fujifilm worth considering. And probably Fujifilm even more, because they don't have a full frame offering, so they have lots of professional grade lenses for APS-C. Probably if you're going full frame, I think, in all honesty, if you're starting out, Canon is, in terms of value, probably the worst, because they locked off their lens mount, and so there's no third-party support, which leaves you with the very expensive, good but very expensive Canon RF lenses. Nikon, they struggled a bit transitioning to their mirrorless offerings, with being the Z6, Z7 series cameras being a bit lackluster, especially in terms of autofocus capabilities. But their recent Z8 and Z9 are expensive but excellent cameras. Just in terms of value, in terms of bang for your buck, I'd probably say go Sony or Panasonic if you want to go full frame, and go Fujifilm or maybe Sony if you want to go APS-C. And that's across all the different personas we talked about. And it's true in video, but that's for another video. Okay. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you got something out of it. Maybe like looking a little bit out of the box, thinking a little bit out of the box in terms of camera systems and sensor sizes, seeing what's out there and what the possibilities are. So as you see, this is a brand new channel, so please if you like the video, even subscribe, because that's obviously hugely beneficial for me. But keep in mind that in the future I'll not only talk about photography, but also about health, finance probably. But I'll keep this theme of having a slightly unorthodox view on things, viewing things from a little bit of a different angle, just like we did with this camera sensor size comparison. Just stepping out of the box and looking at all different possibilities and directions that there are, right? All right, thanks again. I hope you have a great day, week, whatever. Thank you so much, and have a nice day. Bye-bye.